What happens when an emotional experience is both painful and pointless? When it doesn't just hurt, but it seems to have no value, no function, no reason to exist? This question, I suggest, is at the heart of Pixar's rather brilliant movie, Inside Out, because this isn't just a film about growing up, it isn't just about having emotions, it isn't just about accepting sadness. It's about what happens when a psychological system doesn't understand what sadness is for, and therefore does everything it can to avoid it. And I think when we start looking at the film from this perspective, something really interesting happens, not only for understanding the character of Riley in the film, or indeed just for understanding the film itself, but for how that can inform our understanding of ourselves and our behaviours as human beings. And for those of us involved in the acting industry, it gives us lots of interesting opportunities to reflect on how we navigate this profession and how we might want to think about the characters we want to play. So with that in mind, let's take a look at this film together. Welcome to The Matrix at the Movies. At the beginning of the movie, we are introduced to an 11-year-old girl called Riley, and we are also introduced to some emotions who live inside Riley's mind, inside her head. And they are portrayed in the film as little people that literally live inside Riley's mind. And chief amongst those emotions is joy. Joy seems to be the captain of this ship, the dominant figure, the dominant emotion in Riley's HQ. And joy starts the film by introducing us to the other emotions that are there in Riley's mind. And interestingly, she does this by telling us about each emotion and what its function is, what its purpose is in Riley's life. So we meet fear, whose job it is to keep Riley safe. We meet disgust, who stops Riley from being poisoned either physically or socially. And we meet anger, who cares very deeply about fairness and justice and stands up for Riley when those things are at stake. But then we get to sadness. And when we get to sadness, joy admits that no one really knows what sadness is for. And this is really important because sadness is an uncomfortable emotion to experience. So if what sadness represents is pain without purpose, then it makes sense to avoid sadness, to try and keep sadness out of Riley's life as much as possible. And indeed, this assumption, this rule that sadness should be kept away is going to play a very big part in the story. We may notice too that joy isn't given a defined function either.
We do see very clearly the important role that joy has played in shaping Riley's identity. From the moment she was born, being a bundle of joy has defined who Riley is, which makes experiencing sadness not just painful and pointless, but potentially a threat to Riley's identity.
So joy isn't taken as one experience amongst many. Joy is the goal. And this assumption quietly sets in motion many of the things that happen in the film. This internal assumption, this internal rule that Riley should be happy, is put to the test very early by an external event. Out of the blue, as far as Riley is concerned, her parents announce that they are going to leave their home in Minnesota and move to San Francisco. And this is a huge, potentially traumatic, troubling event for Riley, as it is for many people to go through that kind of upheaval, and many young people who experience that during their childhood. And so this is an event that would seem to naturally bring up uncomfortable feelings, including sadness. But as we know, there is an idea, a rule, that sadness is to be avoided. And indeed, this rule is going to be reinforced in these early stages of Riley's life in San Francisco. On Riley's first day at her new school, she's asked to introduce herself to the class, which is a difficult experience in itself. But as she stands up and starts to talk about her old home in Minnesota, she starts to get upset and she starts to cry. Sadness makes its presence felt in Riley's life. And that seems pretty understandable and perhaps significant and meaningful. But from Riley's point of view and from Joy's point of view, this is a complete disaster. To experience sadness in this way, and particularly to be seen to be experiencing sadness in public, is totally unacceptable. And to make matters worse, the memory of crying in the classroom arrives in Riley's HQ, not just as a memory, but as a core memory, as one of the memories that defines Riley's sense of herself and who she is. And Joy sees this and absolutely panics, because that is intolerable. It cannot be that Riley's sense of self is going to include an experience of something like sadness. And so she and Sadness get into a tussle about this. Joy tries to prevent this core memory from being put in place. And as a result, all of the other core memories are dislodged, and those core memories and Joy and Sadness are sucked out of HQ and taken elsewhere. And from this point on, something quite subtle but crucial happens. Be happy stops being a kind of value, something to move towards, and starts becoming an avoidance strategy. Be happy is the solution, the way of getting away from uncomfortable or sad experiences when they show up. It becomes an act, a defense. Just be happy, make this stuff go away. And that's reinforced for Riley externally as well. Her mum tells her to be happy for her dad, because her dad's under a lot of pressure and needs Riley to be their happy little girl. Her dad also reinforces this idea, because when Riley does express some quote unquote negative emotions, he immediately punishes her for that and sends her to her room. So the message is clear. Some emotions are acceptable and some emotions are not. And we can notice very early on here a consequence of this avoidance strategy. When Joy tries to suppress sadness, try and stop sadness, try and avoid sadness becoming an important part of Riley's sense of herself, Riley doesn't just lose her access to sadness, she loses access to joy as well. They are both expelled from HQ. And this seems to me like an important insight, that when we reject and avoid our feelings, we don't just reject them and get rid of them, if we can at all, on some sort of one-by-one selective basis. We narrow down our whole emotional life and our emotional experience. Because if we can't make space for the full range of our feelings, then it narrows what we can experience of our feelings at all. With both joy and sadness gone from HQ, that leaves fear, disgust, and anger at the control panel. And we should be clear here that these emotions are by no means villains in this piece at all, but they are left with a task, and they are left with the only rule they know, which is that Riley should be happy. But without joy and without sadness, they have a very limited range of strategies available to them, which are to distract, to avoid, suppress, to get away from uncomfortable stuff when it shows up. So we see that when Riley speaks to her friend, her former teammate from a hockey team back in Minnesota, this becomes painful. Riley starts to feel uncomfortable and sad about the fact that she's no longer part of it, that she feels that she's being replaced. And so to shut that down, they literally get her to shut down the conversation, shut the laptop on which she's having this conversation. When there are offers of connection from her parents, she shuts them down and pushes them away. And these have short-term payoffs, presumably, in that some of those difficult experiences are shut down and avoided. But we start to see bigger, longer-term consequences, because in following these avoidance strategies, these push the negative stuff away strategies, the islands of personality in Riley's internal world, these connections to these things that are really important to her, hockey and family and all of these things, they start to creak and crumble and look as though they might fall, because in concentrating on avoiding the difficult stuff, she's lost or is losing her connection to the stuff that really matters in her life. And we start to see the consequences of no longer being able or feeling able to move towards what is really important to her. So in Riley HQ, this strategy of avoidance finally crystallizes into a big plan. Riley should run away. She should leave her new home in San Francisco and run back to Minnesota. And there's a clear logic to this, because she was happy in Minnesota. She's not happy here, so she should go back. That makes sense, right? And anger explains this in very clear, very rigid black and white terms. Life for Riley used to be perfect until mum and dad ruined everything. So the solution is clear and obvious. This is bad. There was good. Let's move away from the bad, move back to the good. So this is an away move in a very literal sense, an escape from this situation and these experiences that seem to be uncomfortable and unpleasant. But immediately we can start to see the consequences of this strategy. It is very literally moving her away from something that we know is very important to Riley. It's moving her away from her parents, from her family, but it's also continuing to distance her from connecting with the things that are actually important in her life around her. And we start to see how that plays out in terms of shifts in Riley's behaviors, because she starts to do things that don't seem to align with the values that we know Riley has from what we've learnt about her so far. So she starts to engage in behaviors like stealing money from her mum's purse, to lying to her parents. She narrows her behavior. It becomes rigid and fixed because she has one plan, one solution in mind, which is, I must get out of here. That's the one way, the only way. And there is very little flexibility left in how Riley is responding to the situation and the context that she is in. Let's just take a moment to map this out in terms of the ACT matrix.
If you're unfamiliar with the ACT matrix, please check out the introduction to the matrix video here on the channel. But here's a quick reminder as we go through it for Riley. So in the lower right of this diagram, we put important stuff, values, the things that matter to us in our lives. So for Riley, we're going to put things to do with those islands of personality. So we've got Family Island, we've got Hockey Island, we've got Goofball Island, and so on. These point us to the things that really matter to Riley in her life. In the lower left, we've got what we call yucky stuff or aversive mental content. So these are the experiences that Riley is struggling with and wants to get rid of or avoid. So sadness is our big player here, but we might also want to include things like loss, grief, uncertainty, discomfort, loneliness, and so on. In the upper left, we put what we call away moves, the things that we do, the observable behaviors that we do to move away from the difficult, uncomfortable stuff in the lower left. So for Riley, we have things here like pushing people away, shutting down conversations, closing off to the world, putting up a front. These are her avoidance strategies. And then in the upper right, we'd have towards moves, the things we do to move towards what's important to us. And formally for Riley, these seem to include things like playing hockey, spending time with her family and friends, playing silly games, and so on. But now, not so much. She's so busy on the left-hand side of the matrix that she isn't able or doesn't feel able to engage in towards moves. So what we're saying here is that Riley is experiencing this uncomfortable stuff in the lower left and the threat of experiencing it much more intensely than she feels is acceptable. So she engages in these away moves to avoid all of that. And these give her some very short-term relief, but they're not working for her in the longer term, in that they're just leading back round into being faced with all of these uncomfortable experiences. They're not solving them, they're not getting rid of them. So she has to keep on taking more and more action to avoid those experiences. This leaves her, as I say, feeling unable to engage in meaningful towards moves, and her connection to the important stuff in the lower right starts to disappear from view. And feeling that this isn't working, but not feeling able or knowing how perhaps to change this pattern, she resorts to a bigger away move that is meant to solve everything once and for all. And that is the away move of running away from home.
Meanwhile, out in the wilds of Riley's psyche, joy and sadness are desperately trying to make their way back to HQ and trying to restore the core memories that have been lost with them. And they've found a companion on their journey, Riley's old imaginary friend, Bing Bong. And Bing Bong used to be with Riley all the time. He used to spend all his time with her. She used to spend all her time with him because they were best friends. But those days seem to have passed. Bing Bong has not been in Riley's conscious attention for some while, and he's essentially in the process of being forgotten. And that is a very painful and very sad thing for Bing Bong. And as he is going through this process of realizing and grieving that loss, it becomes overwhelming for him to the point that he sits down at one point and can no longer continue on the journey. Now, Joy sees this experience of sadness and immediately tries to solve it. She says, don't worry, we can fix it. Essentially, be positive, we can sort it out. And when that doesn't seem to work immediately, she tries tickling him, she tries pulling funny faces to distract him, she tries telling him, let's play a game. And sadness does something different. Sadness moves towards Bing Bong, and Joy tries to stop this. She says, don't, you'll only make things worse, because sadness could only possibly make a situation worse, right? But sadness goes to him anyway. Sadness goes and sits with Bing Bong and empathizes with him and validates his experience and his feelings. She acknowledges how important this relationship between Bing Bong and Riley is, and how important it has been, and how sad it is if that has become a thing of the past. And through this, something kind of remarkable happens. For Bing Bong, through literally sitting with sadness for a moment, by experiencing this, having this validation, feeling the acknowledgement of how important his relationship with Riley has been, he finds himself able to then move on, to move forward. And so this is when we get the first glimmer of the idea that maybe sadness does have a function, does have some importance, because it validates the meaning of this relationship. It elicits help from sadness. And it is actually what gives Bing Bong the impetus, having had this validation, to move forward with the journey. Now, despite this experience, and despite another episode that I don't quite have time to go into here, but is really interesting and noteworthy about the best strategy for waking Riley up from a dream, Joy still isn't convinced about the role of sadness in life, and in Riley's life in particular. So as the islands of personality continue to collapse and Joy thinks she's found a super quick route back to HQ, a new problem emerges, because to go in the tube that can shoot them back to HQ involves sadness getting very close to the core memories that Joy is carrying. And as sadness gets close, we can see, and Joy can see, sadness, this blue colour of sadness, starting to exert its influence on the core memories. And Joy's response to that is to say, look, you are hurting Riley. And again, we have this assumption that difficult or negative feelings and emotions are inherently damaging. You're hurting her, you're doing something that is going to cause damage to Riley by getting close to these memories. So Joy makes the decision in the moment that what will be the best thing for Riley is to take this quick route back to HQ, but to leave sadness behind, to abandon sadness altogether. And this plan also backfires, because as the islands continue to collapse around them, the tube shatters, and both Joy and Bing Bong end up not in HQ, but in the memory dump, the place where things go to finally be forgotten. And it is in the memory dump that some of the most significant moments in the film take place. So Joy and Bing Bong land in the memory dump, and Joy's immediate response is to try to scramble out of there, try and solve it. But Bing Bong tells her that it's pointless, there's no way out. And the situation seems so hopeless that not even Joy can avoid experiencing that. And as she does, her attention goes to a memory, the memory of Riley crying in the classroom, the sad memory that was due to become a core memory. And rather than pushing it away, Joy, perhaps for the first time, experiences it, sits with it, again, literally sits with it, and feels her own sadness. And as she does that, she starts to connect with some of the other memories that are there in the memory dump. Joyful, precious memories of Riley as a young child. And again, in this context, for Joy, these memories seem to be tinged with sadness. And she takes them and she cradles them and she experiences the sadness of being with them in this moment. And through experiencing her sadness, she acknowledges just how important this young childlike version of Riley is to her. She acknowledges how hard she's been working to try to protect that version of Riley, to preserve her beautiful, pure happiness, and acknowledge that what she's been doing to achieve that is no longer working. I just wanted Riley to be happy, says Joy, as she cradles these memories and experiences this sadness. And that leads her to realize something else. She looks at another core memory, a joyful memory of Riley being hoisted up by her hockey team with her parents looking on and applauding. And as she looks at this, it changes colour and reveals that there is a sadness connected to this memory as well. Because what happened was that Riley's hockey team had lost a really important match, and Riley had missed the winning shot and felt terrible, felt incredibly sad. And it was the sadness that led to her parents and then her teammates coming and connecting with her and showing her their care and hoisting her up. And in that moment, Joy realizes they came, mum and dad, my teammates, because of sadness. And in this moment, two really important things are revealed, I think, and recognized by Joy. First of all, that sadness is equally connected to what is important to Riley, but also that sadness has an important function, a purpose in Riley's life. And having realized this, Joy gets back to her feet with a new determination, because she's not going to give up, but she is going to try something different. Joy and Bing Bong have a new plan. They find Bing Bong's special rocket ship trolley, and they will use this, powered by Bing Bong's special song, to fly out of the memory dump and get themselves back on track, back moving towards HQ. And in this we see something as well about the function of the kind of joy, the kind of happiness that both Joy and Bing Bong represent, this kind of wave of belief that can make us attempt things that we otherwise would dismiss as being impossible, perhaps allow us to achieve things that we wouldn't otherwise achieve. And it works, almost. They keep on flying up and nearly getting out, nearly getting back, but it's not enough, and they keep on dropping back down again. And it is Bing Bong who recognizes what the difficulty is and what needs to be done. Because Bing Bong and Joy, it seems to me, have both been involved in the same game, in a sense of they've both been wanting to keep hold of this childlike idea of Riley, because she's very important to them, and it's very understandable, and also because they want to avoid the pain of letting that go. But what Bing Bong realizes, I think, is that it is that clinging on, that unwillingness to let go, that is keeping them and Riley stuck, preventing this journey from continuing. And so as they sing the song and the rocket starts to fly, Bing Bong slips off the back of the trolley and consigns himself to oblivion, to being forgotten. And we see here that this painful but important process of letting go, of acknowledging through the pain of it the importance of what is happening, but of letting go of something that is no longer able to work for us, can be a vital part of life and moving forward and getting unstuck from these situations. And as Joy looks down at Bing Bong and as he disappears, his parting line is, take her to the moon for me. And this is not only an emotional gut punch of a line. I think it speaks to something else and something really important, in that that aim, that hope they have for Riley, in a sense, that's not what's being let go of. That direction can still be the same, but what has to happen is a recognition and a realization that as Riley enters this new phase of her life, if she is going to the moon, literally or metaphorically, her means of getting there will have to be somewhat different. And this, in the outer world, is precisely what Riley is still unable to recognize, because she is still in the process of trying to run back to her childhood home in Minnesota. When Joy gets back to HQ, which she achieves not by abandoning sadness, but by bringing sadness with her, what they see is that Riley's emotions have been frozen out altogether. Riley is no longer listening to them. And instead of being guided by them, she is fixed on an idea, the idea that I must run away. And this idea has locked the control panel and stopped Riley from responding to what her feelings are trying to tell her. And Joy looks at this and recognizes that it is sadness who needs to step forward. She allows sadness for the first time to step up to the control panel. And as sadness touches it, and as Riley experiences sadness in this situation, it is that experience that allows Riley to loosen her grip on this idea that running away is the answer to everything, to realize what is really important to her, and that instead of running away from her family, she needs to run towards them. And so that's what she does. She goes back home and she comes in to see her parents, and her sadness almost overwhelms her, and she breaks down and she cries, and she not only experiences that sadness, she shares it with her parents. She tells them what it is that she's feeling, and she says that she hopes they won't be mad at her for not being happy. And what happens is that, far from being mad, her parents validate her feelings and also share them with her, share that they too are sad about what they're leaving behind. And at this point, sadness invites Joy over to the control panel as well. And in this connection that Riley experiences with her family, both joy and sadness coexist as elements of this experience, as elements of this moment and its significance. And that is the moment. That is the moment that allows Riley to move forward into the next phase of life, and that kind of closes the film for us. This realization that sadness and joy are both involved in what is important, are not so much in opposition, but rather flip sides of the same coin, and that emotional experience can be complex and rich and nuanced. And that is what allows Riley's control panel to expand, allows her HQ to prepare for the more complicated experiences of adolescence. And we leave Riley back playing hockey, back connected with her family and hockey and all the stuff that's important to her. But significantly, it isn't just joy that's involved in playing hockey. All of her emotions have their part to play. So let's look again briefly at what these shifts look like and what they mean in terms of the act matrix.
So what shifts here in terms of the matrix? Well, a couple of big things, I think. Riley stops trying to get rid of or avoid her sadness and instead allows herself to experience it. She starts to accept it, not in the sense of saying, right, well, I'm sad, that's my lot in life, I'll just have to resign myself to it, but in the sense of accepting that this uncomfortable emotion is her current experience, I am experiencing sadness. So that allows the away moves to stop, and sadness is allowed to exist. And sadness is also acknowledged on an experiential level as being connected to what is important to Riley. So instead of the presence of sadness automatically leading to away moves, to running away, it actually guides her back, despite it being uncomfortable, to her values. And being reconnected to the lower right, to what's important to her, she starts to make meaningful towards moves again, playing hockey, being with her family, engaging with her new community. So Riley moves over the course of the film from this pattern of stuckness and rigidity and going round and round on that left side of the matrix to finding some flexibility and pursuing the values that matter to her in her life.
So what might we take from looking at this film through an act lens? What might we take from it as human beings? What might we take from it as people navigating the acting industry? And what might we take from it in terms of how we think about character? Well, in terms of life, the film is obviously focused on this particular time in life, this movement from kind of childhood to adolescence. But I think whilst it has a lot to say about that specific moment in life, it applies much more broadly, because we are all, I think, saturated in this narrative, this idea that we're meant to be happy all the time, that so-called negative feelings are kind of pointless, unwanted, serve no useful purpose, are signs that we are broken in some way. And so we can all fall into exactly these patterns that we're seeing playing out, of clinging to rigid ideas about what we're meant to feel and how we're meant to be, rejecting and avoiding experiences that are difficult and failing to see the value in them, and narrowing down our experience and our behavior as a result of that. So I think the movie is an invitation for us to reflect on that, to notice it when it's showing up in our own lives, and to think about what we're willing to experience in order to connect with what really matters to us in our lives. I think as actors, this has a particular resonance, because I think there are some very powerful and very rigid narratives about what acting is meant to be like, how we're meant to experience it, how we're meant to feel about it. And like with Joy and with Riley, some of that is very caught up, I think, and particularly for people who are just coming into training, just coming into the profession, with an idea that we have to cling to our kind of early, pure, joyful experiences of acting that kind of brought us to it, playing dress up and make believe, because of how wonderful that is, but also because we're clinging to the idea that that's what it must be like, that's what it has to be like, and that some feelings, it being difficult, uncomfortable stuff showing up, is unacceptable, that can get us very trapped and very caught up. And we get this idea, acting must be fun. And of course we want joy to be a part of our process, and a hugely valuable part of our process. But as we move towards the realities and the challenges of training, of doing this not just as a game, but as something we want to take seriously, as an art form, of navigating this very difficult industry and profession, we have to perhaps, or we're invited to, I think, looking at this film, to again think about, what are we avoiding? What experiences are we dismissing and rejecting as of no use, that might have really valuable things to offer us? And what might happen? How much more effectively might we connect with and be able to move towards what really matters if we open ourselves up to a much richer, more nuanced, more complex experience of ourselves as actors within this profession? And when it comes to thinking about character, I think the film highlights some really important kind of fundamental questions that sometimes get missed, because we know, many of us, this idea of focusing on the wants, the objective, and we could say, Riley wants to be happy, and that's important. But if we just focus on that, we miss out a lot of this really important stuff of saying, well, what are the experiences that this character is unwilling to tolerate? What are the emotions they dismiss as meaningless to them? What version of themselves are they unwilling to let go of? And what does that do? How does that play out for them? And also, on this character's journey, do they reach a point at which they start to make space for what they've been avoiding and what's been difficult? And how does that change them? How does that change their perspective? Do they start to find this flexibility, or do they continue in this cycle of avoidance? And I think that often has a big part to play in determining whether this is a character journey that leads to growth and to, quote unquote, happy endings, or is this a story and a journey that leads to tragedy?